The courtroom buzzed with a nervous energy, the kind that only arises when something momentous is about to unfold. Judge Marcus Williams, known for his wisdom and calm demeanor, took his place at the bench. His dark, piercing eyes surveyed the courtroom as the proceedings began. Today's case was one of the most high-profile trials of the year. Officer Lindsay Collins, a seasoned white police officer, was accused of using excessive force during a recent arrest. Officer Collins had been involved in a controversial incident where a young black man, Tyrone Carter, was violently subdued during a routine stop. The dashcam footage, which had gone viral, showed Tyrone on the ground, hands raised in compliance, while Officer Collins kneeled on his back, pinning him with excessive force. The public outcry was swift, demanding justice, but Collins, a 5-year veteran of the force, stood firm in her belief that her actions were justified. As the defense attorney presented the case, arguing that Collins had acted in self-defense, it became evident that the officers wasn't just defending her actions, she was belittling the entire process. She sat Saturday with a smug expression on her face, arms folded across her chest, occasionally rolling her eyes at the courtroom's proceedings. Judge Williams, however, maintained his composed and neutral stance, waiting for the facts to unfold. But as the prosecutor began to speak, the tension grew. Collins, seated in the defendant's chair, interrupted the prosecutor's questions. Speaking out of turn, she grinned widely, looking almost as if she were amused by the trial's gravity. "This is absurd," she muttered loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "I'm just doing my job, and now I'm being treated like a criminal." Judge Williams glanced up from his notes, his sharp gaze locking with hers. "Officer Collins, I suggest you maintain decorum in this courtroom. If you continue to speak out of turn, I will hold you in contempt." Collins raised an eyebrow and leaned back in her chair, a smug smile curling on her lips. "Please, Your Honor, you're not going to punish me for having an opinion. I'm an officer of the law. I have rights too, you know." The prosecutor, visibly frustrated, exchanged glances with the judge, but Williams remained calm. "This is not about opinions, Officer Collins. It's about the facts and the law. I'll not ask again for you to show respect in this courtroom." There was a brief pause before Officer Collins sat back in her chair, but the arrogance never left her expression. She tapped her fingers impatiently on the desk in front of her, clearly uninterested in the proceedings. To her, it seemed more like a nuisance than a serious matter. She wasn't worried. She had always believed that as a police officer, she would never be held accountable for her actions. After all, she had been trained to keep the streets safe. Wasn't that what mattered most? But Judge Williams was no stranger to this kind of arrogance. He had seen it before, especially in cases where law enforcement was involved. There were too many officers, too many public figures, who believed they were above reproach simply because of their title. What they failed to understand was that the law was supposed to be impartial. It didn't matter if you wore a badge or a suit. What mattered was justice. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Collins wasn't going to back down. Her defense attorneys worked to spin the narrative in her favor, suggesting that her actions were driven by fear and the pressure of being a woman in a predominantly male occupation. She was portrayed as the victim of fear, of doubt, of an environment that didn't support her. But the more she spoke, the more the courtroom seemed to grow uncomfortable. Her tone was condescending, and her words laced with a hint of disdain for anyone who questioned her actions. The room grew silent when the prosecution called as first witness a young woman who had witnessed the incident from her apartment window. She spoke about the terror she felt as she watched Tyrone on the ground, pleading for mercy. The emotional testimony painted a stark contrast to Collins' dismissive behavior. Judge Williams, ever the professional, maintained his neutrality, but inside, he could feel a familiar fire stirring. He had heard this before: the excuses, the justifications, the sense of entitlement. It was as if the officer saw herself as untouchable, above the very system that was meant to hold her accountable. When the young woman finished her testimony, Collins couldn't help herself. She scoffed loudly from the defense table. "Well, I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I don't see how someone who wasn't even there can possibly understand what happened." Judge Williams's expression tightened, but he didn't react immediately. He knew that this trial wasn't just about what had happened on that street corner. It was about something deeper, a larger, more insidious issue that stretched far beyond the walls of this courtroom. It was about how people like Officer Collins had come to believe that their status and skin color afforded them immunity from the law. It was about the systematic, ingrained prejudice that tainted not just law enforcement, but the judicial system itself. He let the trial continue, knowing that the moment would come when he would have to make a decision. The eyes of the world were on this case. People wanted to know, would a black judge hold a white police officer accountable for her actions? As the court recessed for the day, Judge Williams Saturday in his chambers, stewing in his thoughts. He had spent years building a career on the principles of fairness, equality, and justice. But this was different. Officer Collins was testing him in ways no one ever had before. The stakes were higher than they appeared, and Judge Williams knew that his next move would have consequences far beyond the courtroom. He wasn't just fighting for Tyrone Carter's justice, was fighting for something much bigger. The next day in the courtroom was a stark contrast to the first. The air seemed thicker, that tension palpable. The public had started to take notice of the trial, and reporters from various outlets crowded the back of the courtroom, cameras ready to capture every moment. The judge's calm demeanor contrasted with the increasingly tense atmosphere as the case reached its critical juncture. Officer Lindsay Collins Saturday, in her usual position at the defense table, still exuding the same arrogance that had defined her throughout the trial. She hardly seemed to notice the rising discontent among the witnesses and the mounting frustration from the public. Each time a witness took the stand, she leaned back in her chair, arms folded, lips pursed with a look of disdain, as if she were watching an inconvenient play that she couldn't escape. Her eyes would occasionally dart toward Judge Williams, almost challenging him to confront her, as if daring him to challenge her authority. Objection! Officer Collins called out at a point during the prosecutor's cross-examination of the next witness, a local teacher who had witnessed the arrest. Judge Williams didn't flinch. He had already grown accustomed to her interruptions. Sustained, he said, calmly acknowledging her objection, though he could see that her words were more about testing his patience than offering a valid legal argument. She ignored his ruling and continued, "I'm sorry, but this witness doesn't even know the whole story. How can they testify to something they didn't see clearly?" The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Sheila Matthews, raised an eyebrow. "Officer Collins, the witness testified to what she saw. Are you suggesting she's lying?" Collins snorted dismissively. "No, just that her view was obstructed. That's all." Her voice dripped with a haughty indifference, as if the facts didn't matter as long as she had an answer for everything. The tension in the room mounted as her defiance grew. Judge Williams's gaze turned steely, but it didn't respond directly to her challenge. Instead, he motioned for the next witness to take the stand, but Officer Collins wasn't done yet. "I'd like to remind the court that I'm a trained police officer," Collins said loudly, her voice rising slightly. "I'm here to protect the public. This whole trial is ridiculous." The courtroom grew silent. Judge Williams's pen hovered over his notes, but he made no move to intervene. It was becoming increasingly clear that Officer Collins was more interested in antagonizing the judge than defending herself in any meaningful way. As the day wore on, it became clear to everyone present that Collins was less interested in the trial's outcome and more interested in undermining Judge Williams's authority. Her comments grew increasingly provocative, snide remarks about his rulings, muttered insults about the courtroom's decorum, and even direct challenges to his every word. It was as though she believed that, as a police officer, she was above reproach, above the very judge who had the power to decide her fate. In one particularly charged moment, she openly mocked a witness, a local community organizer, who had spoken about the neighborhood's distrust of the police. As the witness explained how Tyrone Carter's arrest had damaged the community's relationship with the police, Collins' face twisted into a sneer. "So you're saying that because one guy got roughed up, the entire community is going to turn on us?" She interrupted, her voice dripping with disdain. "That's just pathetic." The witness, visibly shaken, struggled to respond, but before anyone could react, Judge Williams's voice rang out with authority. "Officer Collins, I will remind you that this is not the time for personal opinions. You're here to defend your actions, not attack the credibility of others. If you continue to disrupt these proceedings, I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt of court." Collins paused for a moment, staring back at the judge, her lips curling into a small smirk. "Fine, I'm just saying, it's hard to take this seriously when it's clear this is all just an attack on me for doing my job." Judge Williams leaned forward, his voice slow but steady. "Your job, Officer Collins, is to uphold the law, and the law does not allow for disrespect, no matter your position." The courtroom fell silent. For a moment, Collins met his gaze, her eyes narrowing as if she were sizing him up. She was not used to being challenged like this. Her bravado, which had been so effective in the streets, was not translating here. But then, with a flip of her hair and a dismissive wave, she settled back into her seat, a look of calculated indifference masking the crack that had appeared in her confidence. She knew she could push the judge, but deep down, she was beginning to understand that he wasn't going to bend to her will like the others. Judge Williams, meanwhile, took note of her behavior. It was becoming clear that her lack of respect wasn't just aimed at the court. It was rooted in something deeper, something systemic, something that made her believe she could get away with anything because of her position. It was that very mindset that Judge Williams had spent years fighting against, and now it was right in front of him. The trial continued, but the tension in the room could be felt by everyone. The witnesses were visibly unsettled by Collins' behavior. The attorneys were losing patience, and that judge, ever so calm, was growing increasingly resolute in his thoughts. He had seen enough to know that this trial was about more than just a police officer's actions. It was a battle for respect, for the rule of law, and for accountability. But more than anything, it was a moment where he, as a black judge, would have to make a decision that could reverberate beyond this courtroom. As the day came to a close, the proceedings were adjourned. The media were abuzz with discussions about Officer Collins' defiance and Judge Williams' calm authority in the face of it. Outside, reporters gathered in anticipation of the next day's proceedings. The eyes of the public were on them. And this time, it wasn't just about the case at hand. It was about what Judge Williams' next move would be. And as his Saturday alone in his chambers that night, Marcus Williams knew that a decision was coming. A decision that would change everything. Judge Marcus Williams Saturday at his desk in his chambers, staring at the case file in front of him. The room around him was quiet, save for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. He had lived through moments like these before, moments that required him to make decisions that went far beyond the immediate case at hand. But this one felt different. The arrogance of Officer Lindsay Collins was unlike anything he had encountered in his career, and her blatant disrespect challenged him in ways that were personal as much as professional. As his fingers grazed over the case notes, his mind began to drift. He thought about his journey, the path that had brought him to this point. He had always known that becoming a judge would not be easy, but he had never anticipated the level of resistance he would face. Growing up in the South, in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta, Marcus had seen firsthand the corrosive effects of systemic racism. He had felt it from an early age, just as a black child, trying to make his way through an often hostile world, but as a young man trying to prove himself in a field that had little room for people who looked like him. His parents, both educators, had taught him that the path to success would be full of obstacles, but they had also instilled in him a belief that perseverance and integrity were the only tools that mattered. Marcus had internalized that message and used it as his compass. He had spent years studying, working multiple jobs to pay for law school, and eventually passing the bar exam with the kind of determination that made people take notice. But even after all his accomplishments, he had been forced to fight for recognition every step of the way. In his early years as a lawyer, he had seen the system's flaws up close. He had witnessed the way black defendants were treated in the courtrooms, how the police often escaped accountability, and how the justice system favored those with power, privilege, and influence. He knew that change would not come quickly, if at all, but he also knew that he had a responsibility to challenge the system from within. That's why he had become a judge to hold the scales of justice evenly, to make sure that every defendant, regardless of their background or skin color, was treated with fairness. But now, as his Saturday in his chambers, the weight of the moment bore down on him. Officer Collins was a symbol of everything he had fought against. Her entitlement, her dismissal of the law, and her blatant disrespect for him as a black judge were all reminders of the systemic barriers that people like him faced every day. It wasn't just about her, it was about the larger narrative, the way the law had been used to protect those in power while punishing those without it. Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was his clerk, Linda. She stepped into the room with a quiet smile, holding a stack of papers in her hand. Linda had been with Marcus since he was appointed to the bench. She was diligent, sharp, and, like him, acutely aware of the realities of racial inequality in the courtroom. She had witnessed the way people, like Officer Collins, often tried to bend the law to their will, and she had seen Marcus fight against it every step of the way. "You've been quiet today," Linda said as she placed the papers on his desk. "I know this case is weighing on you." Marcus nodded, his mind still heavy with thoughts of the trial. "It's not just this case, Linda. It's everything. Everything I fought for in this career. It's all being tested right now. Linda took a seat across from him, her eyes soft with understanding. I know it's frustrating, but you've always said that justice doesn't happen in a vacuum. You've made your career by challenging the status quo, by making sure the law is fair, even when it's hard. Marcus smiled slightly, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. That's true, but sometimes it feels like the more things change, the more they stay the same. I spent years fighting to be here, fighting to be seen as equal, and now I'm watching someone like Collins ignore everything I've worked for. It's not just about the trial, it's about a bigger issue, a bigger problem. Linda nodded thoughtfully, her expression serious. You've always been a beacon of fairness, Marcus. This isn't just about you, and it's not just about Collins. It's about the system, one that gives her the power to behave this way without consequences. It's about every person who's been overlooked, dismissed, or mistreated by people like her. Your decision matters, not just for this case, but for everything you stand for. Marcus stared at her for a moment, her words sinking in. He had always known that his position carried weight, but it was moments like these that made him realize the full extent of the responsibility. The law was supposed to be blind, but he knew better than most that it was often skewed. It was meant to be impartial, but it had a long history of favoring those who had the most power and influence. His job wasn't just to interpret the law, it was to ensure that the law served everyone equally, regardless of race, class, or privilege. Linda's voice broke through his thoughts again. I don't think Collins realizes what she's doing. She's so used to the privilege that comes with being a white police officer that she thinks she can get away with anything. But you have the power to change that. You have the power to make her understand that no one is above the law, no matter their position. Marcus's eyes hardened with resolve. I know, and I will. He stood up from his desk, his mind made up. He had come to a decision. This wasn't just about Collins, it was about sending a message to everyone who thought they could dismiss the law, especially those in positions of power. This wasn't just about a single case. It was about something much bigger. It was about accountability, fairness, and justice. As Linda left the room, Marcus stood by the window for a long moment, looking out over the city. He knew the decision he was about to make wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be popular with everyone, but he had always believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard. The time for tolerance was over. The time for change had come. The next day, he would make his ruling, and it would change everything. The courtroom was packed the next morning. The air was thick with anticipation as the public and the media alike eagerly awaited Judge Marcus Williams's decision. The trial had taken on a life of its own, moving beyond the legal parameters of Officer Collins' actions and into a wider societal debate about justice, power, and accountability. The eyes of the nation were on them. Today, everything would change. Officer Lindsay Collins, sitting at the defense table, appeared as she always had, arrogant, detached, almost indifferent to the gravity of the situation. She was confident, though, her smile tied with the belief that the system would ultimately protect her. Her defense attorneys, equally assured, whispered among themselves, preparing for the moment when they would undoubtedly celebrate her acquittal. They had faith that the judge would not be bold enough to go against the system they all believed was stacked in their favor. On the other side, the prosecutor, Sheila Matthews, Saturday with a quiet intensity. The case had been a struggle, and the behavior of Officer Collins had only added to the difficulty. But Matthews had seen the cinch, knew that Judge Williams was no ordinary judge. His track record spoke for itself. He had a history of delivering tough, fair rulings, even when it meant going against the grain. Matthews believed in him, even if the pressure surrounding this case was unlike anything they had faced before. The gavel struck the desk, silencing the room. Judge Williams had entered. His presence was commanding, though it didn't with the same arrogance that some of his colleagues did. There was a quiet authority about him that demanded respect. As he sat at the bench and adjusted his glasses, all eyes were on him. He had made no public statements, and there had been little insight into where his decision might land. It was clear to everyone that this case had tested him in ways no previous case had. Officer Collins, please rise. Judge Williams's voice rang out. She rose, her posture stiff, still holding that air of defiance. She had been through the process countless times, and she was certain that this moment would be like all the others in acquittal, a return to her life, and no consequences for her actions. Judge Williams paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the file in front of him. He was acutely aware of what was at stake, not just for Collins, not just for Tyrone Carter, but for the thousands of people who had placed their faith in a system that seemed intent on failing them. This was a moment that transcended the law. It was about something more profound, the power of the judiciary to stand firm in the face of injustice. "Officer Lindsay Collins," Judge Williams began, his voice steady and deliberate, "you stand accused of using excessive force during an arrest, an action that resulted in harm to a young black man, Tyrone Carter. The evidence presented in this trial has been clear and unequivocal. The use of force was not warranted, and your actions were not in line with the standards expected of someone in your position." A ripple of tension passed through the courtroom. Collins, though her face remained composed, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had hoped for a quick and painless resolution, but the judge's words suggested something far more serious. "You have shown a blatant disregard for the people you were sworn to protect," Judge Williams continued. "Your conduct in this courtroom has demonstrated an inability to accept responsibility for your actions and your treatment of others, including witnesses, the prosecutor, and even this court has been disrespectful and unbecoming of an officers of the law." There was a pause. The silence in the room was thick. Judge Williams's gaze remained unwavering as he addressed the court. "Officer Collins, you have failed not only in upholding your duty, but in upholding the very values of justice that are meant to guide this courtroom. You have acted as though the law does not apply to you, as though your badge and uniform shield you from the consequences of your actions. In this courtroom, that will not be tolerated." A hush fell over the room. Collins blinked, her face flushed with disbelief. She had not expected this. She had expected the judge to take the easy route, to allow her to walk away unscathed. But instead, he was holding her accountable in a way she could not have anticipated. The weight of his words was like a hammer, striking her down in front of her peers. "Officer Collins," Judge Williams said, his voice gaining strength with every word, "I find you guilty of excessive force. You will be sentenced accordingly." The words echoed in the room, and a murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. This was it. The moment that so many had feared was now a reality. The law had been upheld, and Officer Collins would face the consequences of her actions. "Sentencing will be scheduled for next week. You are dismissed for today," Judge Williams concluded, his tone final. The gavel came down with a resounding bang, signaling the end of the trial. Collins stood frowning for a moment, her mouth opening and closing, as if trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. Her defense team moved quickly to gather their things, but Collins remained standing, her gaze locked on Judge Williams. For a brief moment, it seemed as though she might protest, might demand that the decision be overturned, but the look in Judge Williams's eyes told her everything she needed to know. This was not a judge she could manipulate or intimidate. This was a man who had dedicated his life to justice, and he would not be swayed by her arrogance. As Officer Collins slowly made her way out of the courtroom, the audience sat in stunned silence. The trial had concluded, but its impact would last far beyond this day. Judge Williams remained seated, his expression calm, though inside, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. The decision had been the right one, but he knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice didn't end with one verdict. It was an ongoing struggle. But today, in his courtroom, the law had prevailed, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that, just maybe, the system had worked as it was meant to. The aftermath of Judge Marcus Williams's verdict reverberated throughout the city, stirring conversations in living rooms, workplaces, and social media feeds alike. The decision to hold Officer Lindsay Collins accountable for the excessive force she had used was monumental, and its impact extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom. For many, it was a long-awaited victory, a symbol that justice could still be served in a world where power often seemed to trump fairness. As the news spread, the reactions were mixed. The media buzzed with stories and opinions from both sides, each seeking to cast the trial as a win or a loss in their own ideological battle. Some hailed the verdict as a courageous stand against police brutality and systemic injustice, while others decried it as an overreach, a politically motivated decision that targeted law enforcement. The debate sparked protests, online forums, and heated arguments in public spaces, but it also ignited a sense of hope for those who had long felt marginalized by a system that appeared to favor the powerful. The protests, however, weren't only on the streets, in boardrooms, on news networks, and among law enforcement circles. The decision stirred unease. Officers and their unions, who had been vocal in their support of Collins, rallied around her, portraying her as a victim of a biased justice system. This is an attack on all of us, one police spokesperson argued in a televised interview. Officer Collins was doing her job. This verdict sets a dangerous precedent. But despite the opposition, Judge Williams remained steadfast. He had expected resistance. In his years of service, he had learned that standing up for what was right often came with a price. He was no stranger to the weight of the decisions he had to make, especially as a black man in a position of authority. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. For every person who challenged his ruling, there were many more who saw it as a beacon of justice, a step toward a fairer and more accountable system. The pressure on him only grew stronger in the days that followed. His phone rang constantly with calls from media outlets, law enforcement representatives, and even political figures who had an interest in the outcome of the trial. Many wanted to know what had driven him to make such a bold decision. Some sought to praise him, while others sought to pressure him to reverse his stance. But Judge Williams remained resolute. He had made his ruling, and he would stand by it, no matter the backlash. It was during one of these phone calls that he found himself face to face with an old friend, Detective James Carter, the father of Tyrone Carter, the young man whose life had been irrevocably changed by the actions of Officer Collins. James had been present in the courtroom during the trial, watching as his son's name became a symbol for the larger fight against police misconduct. James, a seasoned detective himself, had seen the darkness in the world of law enforcement, but he had never imagined that his own son would become a victim of it. "Marcus," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't thank you enough. You gave my son and so many others a chance at justice. You show the world that there's still hope." Marcus was silent for a moment. He had known James for years, and they had shared countless conversations about the struggles within law enforcement, about the need for change. But to hear him speak like this, to hear the gratitude in his voice, he touched him deeply. It reminded him why he had become a judge in the first place. "I'm just doing my job, James," Marcus replied quietly. "The hard part is just beginning. We both know that, but I have to believe that this decision means something, that it matters, not just for Tyrone, but for everyone who's been affected by this kind of violence." James exhaled slowly, his words carrying the weight of everything they had both seen in their careers. "It does matter, Marcus. Trust me. You've given people hope. You've shown that change is possible, even when it feels like the system is stacked against us." Marcus's eyes drifted to the window, where the city skyline stretched out before him. He could hear the distant sounds of traffic, the hum of life continuing in the wake of his ruling. It felt surreal, almost as if the world was holding its breath. He knew this moment would not be the end of the story. The ripple effects of his decision would continue to play out in ways he couldn't fully predict. But for now, he allowed himself a brief moment of peace. However, the calm was short-lived. A few days later, he received an unexpected visitor, Lindsay Collins herself. She entered his chambers without any announcement, a defiant air still lingering about her. Her demeanor was less combative now, but it was clear that she had come to confront him, to somehow wrestle with the consequences of his ruling. Judge Williams didn't stand when she entered, his face unreadable. He had known this moment would come. It wasn't just the media or the public that would demand answers, it was Collins herself. She had to know why she had been held accountable in a way that had never happened to her before. "Judge Williams," she said, her voice tight, though there was a flicker of vulnerability beneath her bravado, "I want to understand. Why me? Why now? What made you think it was okay to do this?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment before responding. "Officer Collins, you stood in this courtroom and showed no respect for the law, for the witnesses, or for the very people you were sworn to protect. Your actions in that moment were not only reckless, they were a reflection of a broader problem within the system, a system that has allowed people like you to act with impunity." Collins' eyes widened in disbelief, her jaw tightening. "I don't get it," she muttered. "I was just doing my job. You don't understand what it's like out there, on the streets. You don't understand the pressure we face." "I understand more than you think," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "I've seen what happens when people in power believe they're above the law. I've seen it destroy lives. I won't let that happen under my watch." For a long moment, Collins said nothing. She stood there, looking at the judge, but in her eyes, there was something different now. Something had shifted, whether it was a grudging respect or something more profound. She didn't quite know. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Marcus to his thoughts. As the door clicked shut behind her, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what this moment would mean for her, whether it would lead to a change in her heart, a change in the way she saw the world, or if it would just be another painful lesson in a career that had already taken so much from her. The ripple effects of his decision had only just begun. The days following Judge Marcus Williams's verdict were tense, not just for the city but for him personally. The storm of controversy that had followed Officer Lindsay Collins' conviction was beginning to take shape, and with it, the growing pressure that would inevitably come with standing against the powerful forces that governed law enforcement. Judge Williams had expected backlash, but he hadn't anticipated the sheer volume of vitriol directed his way. While there had been supporters who praised his decision, many others, ones who lived with the privileges of power, authority, and the status quo, were less than pleased. The media continued to feed the fire, with headlines depicting him as a radical judge who had overstepped his bounds, a judge willing to sacrifice law enforcement for political points. Behind the scenes, there were whispers of appeals, of attempts to have his ruling overturned, and, most ominously, of a quiet campaign to discredit him. It began in small ways: anonymous letters filled with accusations of bias, phone calls from unfamiliar numbers demanding he reconsider his verdict, and a series of complaints from local police unions about his impartiality. It was clear that they didn't just want Collins to be acquitted, they wanted to punish the judge for daring to challenge the power of the badge. One morning, a group of police officers staged a protest outside the courthouse, waving signs that read, "Justice for officers and stop attacking our heroes." They shouted slogans demanding accountability for Judge Williams, claiming that he had made a mockery of law enforcement. Some carried flags, others wore uniforms, but it was the same message repeated over and over: a call for retribution. The protest was well organized and, in its own way, effective. Reporters gathered in front of the courthouse, eager to capture the confrontation between the community's perceived protectors and the men who had dared to challenge them. It was clear that the protest was intended to create chaos, to disrupt the court's proceedings, and to unsettle Judge Williams. The optics of this situation were powerful. It was the image of a black judge standing alone against a sea of uniformed white officers, their faces hardened with anger and disdain. It was a narrative that many would easily latch onto. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Judge Williams walked to his bench with a composed expression, though beneath the surface, his thoughts were anything but calm. He had never been one to let external pressure affect his decisions, but he knew that this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about Officer Collins' interactions. It was about the integrity of the entire justice system, and whether or not the people could trust it to stand for fairness. He looked out over the courtroom as the proceedings began. The prosecutor, Sheila Matthews, was at her table, quietly going through her notes. The defense attorney, a man named Ronald Pierce, sat across from her, his face an unreadable mask. But it wasn't the lawyers, or even the defendants, who caught his attention. It was the sea of faces in the gallery. They were filled with both scrutiny and expectation, as if they were all waiting for him to make the wrong move. As the gavel struck, marking the beginning of another day's hearing, Marcus's mind wandered to the calls he had received the night before. One in particular stood out, a voice from his past, someone who had known him well when he was a young attorney. It was a friend, a former colleague, and now a prominent politician. The voice on the other end had been smooth, calm, but there was a hint of something else. Something veiled. "Marcus, I need you to understand something," the voice had said. "You've made an enemy of a lot of powerful people. You've got to think about the long game here. This isn't just about the trial, it's about your career. You've taken a position that's going to make things difficult for you down the line. I'm telling you this as a friend. You need to think this through." It was a warning, delivered with a knowing tone that suggested consequences. Marcus had listened intently, but he had heard it all before. His entire career had been built on resisting the pressures to conform, to stay silent in the face of injustice. It was no different now. He had to trust that the truth would ultimately prevail, even if it came at a personal cost. He had expected the backlash, but what unsettled him more was the quiet, insidious nature of it. It wasn't just the protests outside the courthouse or the media, but it was the people he thought he could trust, the whispers among his colleagues, the subtle isolation he was beginning to feel from others in the legal community. Those who had once seen him as a rising star now seemed to regard him with suspicion. "Don't you think you've gone too far, Marcus?" one of his fellow judges had asked in a private conversation just the day before. "The public opinion is turning against you. People are questioning your judgment, your objectivity. You may be setting a dangerous precedent." It was a sentiment that was echoed by others. Some of his colleagues began to distance themselves, choosing not to engage in conversations about the case, as if the very mention of it could tarnish their reputations. The case had become toxic, and they didn't want to be associated with it. It was a familiar feeling, had experienced it before in his career, but it still stung. The pressure was mounting, and Marcus could feel the weight of it. But despite the mounting tension, he remained unwavering. He could not and would not allow himself to be intimidated. The pressure from his peers, from law enforcement, and even from political figures was real, but it would not alter his course. That evening, as Marcus arrived home to his modest apartment, he was greeted by his wife, Alicia, who had been quietly following the events unfolding around her husband. Alicia had always been his rock, the person who helped him stay grounded, but even she was concerned. She could see the toll the case was taking on him, the sleepless nights, the constant barrage of phone calls, and the weight of the decisions that had been made. "Marcus, I know you're under pressure," Alicia said softly, looking at him with concern. "But don't forget why you're doing this. You didn't take this job to be popular. You took it to make a difference." Marcus smiled at her, his eyes tired but filled with resolve. "I know, but sometimes the difference is harder to make than you think." Alicia wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "Just don't forget who you are. Don't forget why you're here." In the days that followed, the court would face mounting pressure to reverse Judge Williams's decision, but the judge had already made up his mind. He would stand firm, no matter the consequences. He knew that this wasn't just about him, it was about the very idea of justice itself, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Not now, not after everything he had fought for. The backlash would continue, but so would his resolve. The battle was far from over. As the weeks passed, Judge Marcus Williams's decision continued to dominate the media landscape. The courtroom drama surrounding Officer Lindsay Collins' conviction had evolved into something larger, an ideological battleground. Some hailed the ruling as a triumph of accountability, while others saw it as an overreach by an activist judge. The echo of division reverberated through the community, and the pressure mounted on all fronts. But just when Marcus thought he had faced the worst of the backlash, a new challenge emerged on that he hadn't seen coming. It came in the form of an official complaint. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in his office, reviewing his case files for the day, a letter arrived. It was handed to him by his clerk, along with a brief note. The letter was from the state's Judicial Review Board, a body tasked with overseeing judicial conduct. At first glance, Marcus thought it was simply another letter of condemnation from his detractors. But as he opened it and began reading, his stomach sank. The complaint had been lodged by several local police officers and supported by a prominent legal advocacy group. It accused Marcus of bias, claiming that he had acted in a politically motivated manner during the trial of Officer Collins. The complaint argued that by convicting Collins, he had overstepped his bounds and violated his duty to remain impartial, citing his personal history and alleged racial prejudice as the basis for their concerns. The letter called for an investigation into his conduct, threatening disciplinary action, and even the potential for impeachment. Marcus felt the weight of the words in that letter. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned his impartiality, but the stakes were higher now. The public spectacle of his decision had drawn sharp lines between his supporters and detractors. He had become a symbol, not just of justice, but of everything that was wrong or right with the system. And now, his judicial career was on the line. He set the letter down carefully, his fingers lingering on the edges of the paper. He wasn't surprised, knew this was coming. What shocked him more was the realization that his very integrity was being called into question by the very people he had fought to uphold justice for. The thought stung. It was one thing to face public opinion or protests. It was another to have your peers in the legal system, the ones who were supposed to understand the gravity of your decisions, questioning your competence. The complaint was a clear attempt to silence him, to make him a cautionary tale for other judges who might be thinking of stepping out of line. But Marcus wasn't the type to bow to pressure. He had spent his entire career battling for fairness and accountability, and this would not be the moment that broke him. If anything, it would strengthen his resolve. That evening, Marcus sat down with Alicia at their kitchen table, the weight of the letter heavy on his shoulders. Alicia, who had been with him through every difficult case and every political storm, immediately saw the concern etched across his face. "What is it, Marcus?" she asked, her voice gentle but knowing. "It's the Judicial Review Board," he replied, his voice low. "They filed a formal complaint against me. They're accusing me of bias in the Collins case. They want to investigate me for misconduct. Alicia frowned, her eyes narrowing with frustration. For doing your job, for holding someone accountable. Marcus nodded. Exactly. The complaint is full of accusations of racial bias, political motivations. It's a calculated attack on my credibility. They want me to fall. Alicia took his hand in hers, squeezing it tightly. You've always known this kind of thing could happen. It's not about the truth, Marcus, it's about who has the power. But you can't let them get to you. You're doing the right thing. You've always done the right thing. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. I just didn't think it would come to this. I've never been afraid of facing adversity, but this feels different. The people I'm up against, these are the same people who control the system. They're used to winning. Alicia looked at him with a soft but determined expression. And that's why you have to stand strong. You're not just fighting for yourself, Marcus. You're fighting for every person who has been ignored or mistreated by that same system. This is bigger than you. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in days, Marcus felt a glimmer of clarity. He had been questioning whether the fight was worth it, but Alicia's reminder of his purpose reignited something inside him. He wasn't just some judge passing rulings. He was a man with a responsibility to truth, responsibility to fairness, and responsibility to those who had no voice in the halls of power. The next day, Marcus made his decision. He wouldn't hide. He wouldn't back down. Instead, he would face the challenge head-on. He would stand in front of the Judicial Review Board and make his case, not as a man who had made a mistake, but as a man who had acted with unwavering conviction. He would prove that his decision in the Collins case was not one of bias, but one of integrity. It would be his moment to defend not only his ruling, but the very principles of justice that had guided his entire career. But there was more at stake than just his own reputation. As he prepared for the investigation, he began to realize that the outcome of this battle would shape the future of his career and the future of a justice system that many believed was failing. If he were to lose, he would send a message to other judges, to the public, to the system itself, that holding the powerful accountable was too dangerous, too radical, too costly. And if he were to win, it could be the turning point in a larger movement, the beginning of a shift in the way justice was administered, a shift that demanded equality for all, regardless of race, status, or occupation. The stakes were higher than ever. The day of the Judicial Review Board's hearing had arrived. Marcus Williams stood in front of a panel of 9 judges, each of them dressed in their black robes, their faces as stern and inscrutable as the law itself. It was a formal and austere setting, the room filled with the air of anticipation and judgment. In front of him, at the head of the table, sat Judge Meredith Hayes, the head of the board, a woman who had spent her entire career climbing the ranks of the judiciary and had little patience for public spectacle. She regarded Marcus with a gaze that felt more like a microscope than an evaluation. You understand why you're here, Judge Williams, Judge Hayes said, her voice measured but firm. The complaint against you concerns the verdict you issued in the case of Officer Lindsay Collins. You've been accused of exceeding the bounds of impartiality and allowing personal bias to influence your decision-making. Do you understand the seriousness of these charges? Marcus nodded, his posture straight as an arrow. His mind was focused, his heart steady, though beneath the surface, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. This wasn't just about defending his actions, it was about defending the integrity of the justice system he had worked so hard to be a part of. He had spent years earning his seat on the bench, and now his very career was on trial. I understand, Your Honor, Marcus replied, his voice calm and steady, but I must emphasize that my decision in the Collins case was made with careful consideration of the law, the facts, and the testimony presented. My ruling was based on the evidence before me, and I stand by it. Judge Hayes' expression remained unreadable, but the subtle tightening of her lips hinted at the skepticism she was trying to hide. We are here to evaluate whether your ruling was influenced by factors outside of the law. Judge Williams, you're aware that your history, your background, and your public statements have led many to believe that your decision was driven by personal agendas, rather than legal considerations. Marcus's thoughts flashed to the protests, the public outcry, the relentless media scrutiny. He had known from the beginning that his background as a black man in a position of power would be scrutinized in ways that others might never face. He had long accepted that reality, but it still stung to have it thrown in his face in such an official manner. I am aware of the accusations, Your Honor, he said, meeting her gaze with unwavering resolve, but I can assure you that my decision was not swayed by race or politics. It was based on the law and my duty to ensure that justice was served. The board remained silent for a moment, considering his words. To anyone who knew Marcus, it was clear that he believed in what he was saying. He was not some radical judge, acting out of personal vendetta or ideological bias. He was a man who had spent his career fighting for justice and equality, who had fought for the rights of the oppressed, and who had never once allowed personal feelings to color his legal rulings. The hearing proceeded with a barrage of questions, each one designed to probe his integrity and objectivity. Some were direct, others were more subtle, but all were pointed, seeking to undermine his credibility. It was a grueling process, one that tested his patience and composure, but Marcus stood firm, answering each question with clarity and calmness, never once losing his temper or his focus. The prosecutor, a man named Harold Davies, questioned Marcus about the specific details of the trial. Judge Williams, he began, his tone measured but with an underlying hint of accusation. In your ruling, you referenced the broader issues of police brutality and systemic racism. Could you explain how those factors influence your decision in this case, given that the charge against Officer Collins was not one of racial discrimination but of excessive force? Marcus took a deep breath before responding, his voice steady but resolute. The issue of systemic racism is not something that exists in isolation, Mr. Davies. It is a reality that permeates every aspect of our society, including law enforcement. While the charge against Officer Collins was not explicitly about race, the context of her actions should disregard for the life of a black man cannot be separated from the broader patterns of behavior that we've seen in law enforcement. My decision was not based on race alone, but it would have been irresponsible not to consider the implications of these broader issues when determining the appropriate sentence. There was a brief silence in the room as the weight of his words settled over the board. Marcus knew that his answer would not satisfy everyone, but it was the truth, and sometimes the truth was the hardest thing to say, especially when it challenged the status quo. The questioning continued for several more hours, with Marcus defending his actions with the same conviction and integrity that had guided him throughout his career. The tension in the room was palpable, and each question seemed to hang in the air longer than the last. But Marcus held his ground, never once backing down nor compromising his principles. As the hearing neared its conclusion, Judge Hayes addressed the board one final time. We have heard the arguments from both sides, and we will now deliberate on whether Judge Williams's actions warrant disciplinary action. This process may take some time, but a decision will be rendered in due course. Judge Williams, you may be excused. Marcus nodded and stood, his heart heavy with the uncertainty of the outcome. He had said his piece, defended his decision, and now all he could do was wait. The waiting was the hardest part. He knew that the board's decision could change everything: his career, his reputation, his future. But even as he walked out of the room, he couldn't help but feel that he had done everything in his power to stand for what was right. As he stepped into the hallway, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from Alicia. "I'm so proud of you. You're doing the right thing, no matter what happens." The words were simple, but they gave him a sense of peace. He had come this far, and no matter what the future held, he knew that he had acted with honor. He had stood up for justice, and that, he believed, was something worth fighting for. The days following the hearing felt like an eternity. Judge Marcus Williams's mind was consumed by the uncertainty of what would come next. The weight of the hearing, the probing questions, and the accusations of bias lingered in the back of his mind. The Judicial Review Board had taken their time deliberating, and as the hours stretched on, so did his anxiety. But no matter the outcome, Marcus knew he had done his best to stand by his principles. He had fought for justice when it seemed like the world was pushing back against it, and for that, he had no regrets. Alicia had been his rock throughout this process. She remained calm, supportive, and unwavering. She had been there when the protests started, when the complaints surfaced, and when the scrutiny mounted. Through it all, she had reminded him of why he had taken this job in the first place, not for the applause, not for the prestige, but to serve a higher purpose, to right the wrongs and to hold those in power accountable, no matter the cost. Finally, after what felt like weeks of anticipation, Marcus received the news he had been waiting for. The Judicial Review Board had reached its decision, and he was to appear before them once more. The day was set. It was a pivotal moment, the culmination of everything he had worked for. The decision would either vindicate him or shatter his career. But Marcus wasn't afraid anymore. He had stood tall, and now he was ready to face whatever came. When the day of the verdict arrived, the atmosphere in the courthouse was electric. Word had spread quickly that the hearing was taking place, and as Marcus entered the room, he saw the familiar faces of his colleagues and the members of the public who had been following the case. The gallery was filled with both supporters and detractors, each group eager to see how the board would rule. Judge Meredith Hayes, once again presiding over the proceedings, began the session with her customary formality. She glanced briefly at Marcus before turning her attention to the board. The room was quiet, the only sound the shuffling of papers as the members of the board prepared to announce their decision. Judge Williams, Hayes began, her voice carrying across the room. We have concluded our deliberations regarding the complaint against you. After careful consideration of the evidence presented during the hearing and a thorough review of your actions, we find that your ruling in the case of Officer Lindsay Collins was not influenced by personal bias or racial prejudice. We also find no evidence that your decision was driven by political motivations or an agenda outside of the law. Marcus exhaled slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this was the turning point, the moment that would determine everything. However, Hayes continued, we recognize the public controversy surrounding this case and acknowledge the concerns raised regarding your conduct. While we do not believe that you violated any ethical standards, we recommend that you undergo additional training in judicial impartiality and public relations to ensure that your future rulings are perceived as fair and unbiased by all parties involved. The room was silent as the board's decision hung in the air. It wasn't a complete exoneration, there was a note of caution, a recognition that the optics of his decision could have been managed better, but it was not the condemnation that many had hoped for. In fact, it was a victory. Marcus had been cleared of the most serious charges, and though there was an expectation for further self-reflection, he had been vindicated in the eyes of the law. The room erupted into murmurs, some of discontent, others of relief. Marcus could hear his name being whispered by his supporters, those who had followed his journey from the beginning. He felt a surge of pride. His heart was heavy with the weight of the long battle, but it was also filled with gratitude. His career, his reputation, had survived. More importantly, justice had prevailed. He turned to look at Alicia, who sat in the front row of the gallery, her eyes shining with pride. She smiled at him, her face a mix of relief and happiness. It was a smile that spoke volumes and that told him everything he needed to know. The fight had been hard, but it had been worth it. After the hearing, Marcus stood outside the courthouse, taking in the fresh air. The sun was shining, and for the first time in days, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He had been cleared, but the battle had taken its toll. It was clear to him now that his decision in the Collins case had been just the beginning. There was more work to be done, more fights to be fought, and more battles to win. The challenges he had faced were far from over. In fact, they were only beginning. But as he stood there, surrounded by those who had supported him and those who had doubted him, he realized something important. The fight for justice was never easy. It was never clean or straightforward. It was messy, often painful, and sometimes it felt like the world was against you. But the moment you stopped fighting was the moment you lost. Marcus knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The controversy surrounding his decision would linger, and he would continue to face challenges in his career. But he was ready. He had stood up for what was right, and that was something no one could take away from him. As he walked away from the courthouse, Alicia by his side, Marcus knew that his work wasn't finished. The justice system was still flawed, still riddled with inequities, but he was one step closer to making it better, and that was all he could ask for. Thank you for watching till the end. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends. To subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories. Have a nice day.